Hi guys and welcome. This is Jen Gaeta Siciliano, artist, memoir writer, bipolar psychiatric survivor, and your host of Not As Crazy As You Think podcast, the place that offers an alternative perspective on mental illness, highlighting creativity, non-conventional healing, and breaking on through to the other side. If you are ready for a new narrative on the mental realm that celebrates crazy and cool without penalty, then Not As Crazy As You Think is for you. So there was a lot of talk on Twitter this week on hashtag chemical imbalance, referring to a theory in psychiatry that is now being unowned by any psychiatrist who still wants to be respected. A biochemical abnormality, or specifically a deficiency in a neurotransmitter like serotonin, for instance, has never been demonstrated in any psychiatric disorder, nor are there any references to such a thing found in medical textbooks. They point to speculations and potential biological mechanisms and suggest that breakthroughs are anticipated in the field, but nothing has been proven. So, with medication advocates and the entire mental health industrial complex dripping confidence in how psychiatric drugs can correct chemical imbalances, they are not using any research to support their claims, just wishful metaphorical thinking. I remember back in 2014, I had a particular heated debate with a friend who was convinced that the chemical imbalance theory had been irrefutably proven without doing the slightest bit of research on the issue. Even then, nothing was farther from the truth. That same year, the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry published the research supporting this fact. Psychiatric drugs have often been prescribed to patients on the basis that they cure a chemical imbalance. However, no chemical imbalances have been proven to exist in relation to any mental health disorder. There is also no method available to test for the presence or absence of these chemical imbalances. Says professor and author of the 2014 book, Cracked: The Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry, Dr. James Davies. Despite literally thousands of studies that have investigated this area, we still do not have one piece of direct evidence that proves the theory correct. But somehow, this theory over the years and over decades gained widespread momentum internationally as true science seems to travel, and people accepted it without any investigation because it was purported as truth time and time again. In fact, by 2005, the American Psychiatric Association reported that 75% of Americans believed in these claims. I've had dozens of psychiatrists who were forced upon me throughout the course of my life tell me the same narrative. The psychiatric survivor movement has thousands of people all saying the same story as well. Why are so many of us on lifelong medication for a thing that's never been substantiated in our medical files or anywhere else? According to the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, said Dr. David Kaiser from the Psychiatric Times, patients have been diagnosed with chemical imbalances, despite that no test exists to support such a claim, and that there is no real conception of what a correct chemical balance would look like. I repeat, there are no tests for chemical imbalances. In no instance would we accept that we have a chronic physical illness requiring lifelong medication unless there was some kind of reliable biological test that could support such a claim. Imagine you suspect you have high blood sugar. You go to your doctor with your concerns, and he suggests a test that will determine your levels so that he can accurately diagnose you. If the tests come back negative and show you have proper levels, you are relieved. If, on the other hand, levels show otherwise, a course of treatment is suggested. This is how a physical illness is addressed. In contrast, if you walk into a psychiatrist's office stating your list of symptoms, the first thing the psychiatrist does is refer to his Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the current edition DSM-5, which contains 374 mental illness labels, with descriptions of observable behaviors, most of which can only be measured by the patient's self-reporting. Again, no tests determining chemical levels were ever given to the people who are actually suffering with mental illness symptoms. So how can we know for sure that the mentally ill have irregular chemistry inside their brains, especially when there are no baseline tests for the normal brains? And who is normal exactly? To be blunt, we are actually being compared to rats in a cage. Since the research is limited because of ethics and human experimentation, Peter Breggin in his book, Your Drug May Be Your Problem, How and Why to Stop Taking Psychiatric Medications, describes how the research is carried out. Because there is no other way to do it, the basic biochemical research on drug effects is carried out on animals rather than on humans. Most of the information about a psychiatric drug's biochemical effect is deduced from conducting tests on living animal brains, or more often from killing the animals in order to study their brain tissue following exposure to drugs. Furthermore, the animals almost never have anything wrong with them. The drug effects are being studied in healthy mammalian brains. In short, when explaining how a psychiatric drug like Prozac or lithium affects the biochemistry of the human brain, researchers are drawing almost entirely on animal research conducted on normal mammalian brains rather than from studies involving people with supposed biochemical imbalances in their brains. Back in the day, being a somewhat astute individual, even at the age of 22 on antipsychotics, I knew how unscientific this all was about 3 decades ago. That they were coming up with this reasoning that I had brain malfunction in the middle of my trying to reveal to them the trauma that was completely ignored, and despite the fact that they only came to this conclusion based on the assumption that I was already ill before any testing, showed me very clearly that it was made up, because they had already married themselves to the idea that treatment for my ailment needed to be drug-related, meaning cash for the drug companies and the business of medicine. And their narrative would force me to stick to my treatment plan for lifelong antipsychotics. One might say, well, it's comforting to have a name for something that ails you, and a cause, something that is biological, outside of your control, something that is not your fault. But removing your agency from the equation removes your ability to control your own life and gives it over to the drug companies instead. And this myth has done much more to disable millions and certainly has done very little to heal. We were conditioned to believe such a tale. And even to this day in 2022, I personally know people saying things like, I know it's just something in my biological chemistry that makes me this way, or memes on Twitter like, at this point in my life, I need meds to keep my brain healthy, and there is nothing wrong with that. No, there's nothing wrong with that, except that it's completely inaccurate. Your brain is not healthier with psych meds. These meds are toxic, and with long-term use can create organ failure and potentially reduce a person's life by 20 years. Think again. So why does the majority of Americans believe this theory to be proven true? It's called propaganda, and this conflict of interest on the part of the pharmaceutical industry is ruining our healthcare systems, and the corruption is worldwide. Author and professor Peter Goethe, who wrote the book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare, stated in an interview conducted by the film Medicating Normal, I have worked for many, many years to find out to what extent we can believe in drug trials, and it's actually quite depressing. We cannot believe what gets published in our most prestigious journals because it is usually done by the drug industry. You have an expression in America, torture your data until they confess, and this happens all the time. The drug industry has an enormous conflict of interest. The difference between an honest data analysis and one you have manipulated can be worth billions on the world market. The myth that depression is the result of a chemical imbalance was widely promoted by Eli Lilly, for instance, the creators of Prozac, approved by the FDA in 1987, which was one of the first most predominantly utilized medications to treat depression. But it didn't start with them. We can learn much from other big pharma stories which recently have become quite popularized. In the book Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, brilliantly written by Patrick Radden Keefe, the Sackler family had the same idea about biochemistry, a family whose convictions eventually made them the kings of OxyContin and the center of scandalous lawsuits in the opioid crisis. Arthur Sackler started out as a psychiatrist at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center of Brooklyn State Hospital in the 1940s, and later encouraged his brothers to come on board. They witnessed and performed hundreds of electroshock therapy sessions and believed there had to be a better way. Mental illness seemed to be increasing faster than asylum space. Was there a way to keep these people out of the hospitals? Arthur didn't believe in what the eugenicists said, that madness was immutable and untreatable. And he wasn't convinced that Freud had it right either, that one's lived experience and early childhood trauma were the cause of such states. He was convinced it was biochemical and began experimenting on patients at Creedmoor, injecting them with histamine and seeing that some responded well. Publishing hundreds of papers thereafter and using his experience as an editor, a marketing director, and an ad man for the pharmaceutical industry, Arthur attracted press coverage that declared he had found a way for patients to avoid hospitalization. An article in Better Homes and Gardens declared that the chemical activity theory of the Sacklers is as revolutionary and almost as complicated as Einstein's relativity. So the Sacklers seem to have defied the age-old medical riddle about mental illness that confused people for centuries. If the problem of mental illness originated in brain chemistry, then perhaps the cure for insanity was simply taking a pill. In addition to this full-time residency at Creedmoor, Arthur was also working in advertising, promoting pharmaceuticals, and got creative with eye-catching, splashy ads marketed directly to prescribers in medical journals and distributed literature to doctors' offices. He enlisted prominent doctors to endorse his products, and drug companies cited scientific studies, which the drug companies underwrote. So it was Arthur who was credited with revolutionizing the whole field of medical advertising. Eventually, Sackler was involved with the advertising of huge biochemical successes like Valium and Librium and changed the landscape of medical advertising forever, setting the precedent. And we are now left with the results of unchecked power in the hands of this greedy industry since this era. In an article published on May 20th, 2021 by Jim Folk, who's president of AnxietyCenter.com, titled Chemical Imbalance Theory False, he records where we have actually, in reality, heard these claims. If not from textbooks, in psychiatry, or within their professional communities, then in the hands of money giants out to make a buck. Lexapro's website, for example, a popular antidepressant that is said to be able to restore this chemical imbalance, stated on its website on May 1st, 2009, whatever the circumstances, depression is caused by an imbalance of certain chemicals in the brain. Normally, these chemical messengers help nerve cells communicate with one another by sending and receiving messages. They may also influence a person's mood. In the case of depression, the available supply of the chemical messengers is low, so nerve cells can't communicate effectively. This often results in symptoms of depression. And on Paxil's website, an antidepressant that is said to be able to restore this chemical imbalance, stated on May 1st, 2009, scientific evidence suggests that depression and certain anxiety disorders may be caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Paxil CR helps balance your brain's chemistry. Just as a cake recipe requires you to use flour, sugar, and baking powder in the right amounts, your brain needs a fine chemical balance in order to perform at its best. Normally, a chemical transmitter in your brain called serotonin helps send messages from one brain cell to another. This is how the cells in your brain communicate. Serotonin works to keep the messages moving smoothly. However, if serotonin levels become unbalanced, communication may become disrupted and lead to depression, anxiety, and PMDD. Paxil CR helps maintain a balance of serotonin levels, which may help cell-to-cell communication return to normal. Paxil CR is with you throughout your day to help you manage and treat your condition. And on Zoloft's website, an antidepressant that was said to be able to restore this chemical imbalance, stated on May 1st, 2009, Zoloft is a type of antidepressant known as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRI. Nerve cells in the brain and the rest of the nervous system use chemical messengers. These messengers help cells send messages to each other. One of these messengers is called serotonin. Studies show that serotonin plays a vital role in how our body works. It controls sleep, appetite, temperature, and blood vessel tone. It's also in charge of the release of certain hormones and how much pain we feel. Because it is linked with so many functions in our body, serotonin has an effect on a wide range of conditions such as depression. This tie between depression and serotonin led scientists to an interesting find. Scientists believe people with depression could have an imbalance of serotonin in their brain. That means the level of serotonin is off. So the nerve cells can't communicate or send messages to each other the right way. This lack of contact between cells might cause depression. Zoloft helps fix this. Zoloft helps the nerve cells send messages to each other the way they normally should. And even on Effexor's website, another antidepressant that was said to be able to restore this chemical imbalance on May 1st, 2009 stated, Effexor XR is believed to treat depression and anxiety symptoms by affecting the levels of two naturally occurring chemicals in the brain, serotonin and norepinephrine. It is believed that correcting an imbalance of these two chemicals may help relieve symptoms. Because Effexor XR affects these two chemicals, it is known as an SNRI, or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Does this all sound familiar? We remember the TV ads too, with cute little innocent cartoons that spoke to our inner child about such claims. In the 1950s and 60s, the industry started out using a drug-centered approach. That is the claim that the drugs create an abnormal or altered brain state, that the useful effects are a consequence of drug-induced changes to normal brain functioning. Joanna Moncrief, professor of critical and social psychiatry at University College London and author of the book The Myth of Chemical Cure, speaks about this distinction between the disease-centered approach and the drug-centered approach. She spoke in a conference on health in a talk called The Myth of Chemical Cure, How and Why We Misunderstand Psychiatric Medicine, and said, the effects that we see when people take some psychiatric drugs, whether we deem them to be useful or not useful, are a consequence of these alterations to normal brain processes. So an example of this model might be the use of alcohol for social anxiety. When I was training as a junior doctor, I was taught that alcohol could be useful for people with intense social anxiety. It wasn't being suggested that social anxiety was due to an alcohol deficiency. It wasn't even being suggested that alcohol was correcting from an underlying chemical imbalance. It was being suggested that the alterations produced by alcohol, the typical state of alcohol intoxication, which we're all familiar with, is characterized by social disinhibition. And that could help counteract intense social anxiety in someone who suffered from that. She goes on to explain that in the 1950s and 60s, the idea that they are actually treating an underlying disease in some way, that they're doing something specific, that they're doing more than just tranquilizing people, had come to pass. And by 1970, you've got this idea that they're targeting psychotic symptoms or targeting the underlying basis of psychosis or schizophrenia. And they start to be referred to as antipsychotics, or a similar thing happens with antidepressants. So over the course of the 1950s and 60s, you get this change in understanding of drugs from a drug-centered model to understanding them as a disease-centered model. By the time Big Pharma took over psychiatry in the 1980s with the publication of DSM-3 in 1980, which did away with considering context as a factor to assigning diagnoses, now relied more than ever before on the biological causes of mental illnesses, even without proof of such a thing. And it wasn't difficult to perpetuate the myth with publications like the 1985 book The Broken Brain, The Biological Revolution in Psychiatry by Nancy C. Andreasen. By the time the 1990s rolled out the atypical antipsychotics, people were convinced of this disease-centered model, namely that drugs correct an abnormal brain state, drugs target specific diseases or abnormalities, and the therapeutic effects of such drugs arise from their effects on disease pathology or the biological mechanisms that produce symptoms. The diabetes insulin metaphor was a doctor favorite, and many survivors can attest to this. And even Freud's psychoanalysis was out the window at this point, seeming passé and outdated, next to the heralded revolution upon us. Pharmaceutical companies thrive on the premise that drug treatment is not only an option, but most often a necessity requiring ongoing maintenance. Once the drug is taken, a dependency is efficiently created, properly coded insurance claims are submitted, and a lifelong customer is attained. So in a world where we believe with certainty things can only be true if it's backed up by science, where things can only be considered part of our reality if they are established through some measuring tool showing some kind of empiricism, we have taken all the psychiatric jargon as true when there is no conclusive evidence whatsoever. As Peter Breggin mentions in his book, Your Drug May Be Your Problem, we have no techniques for measuring the actual levels of neurotransmitters in the synapses between cells. So all this talk about biochemical imbalances is just guesswork. If anything, what is being studied is how psychiatric drugs disrupt brain processes, showing they actually create imbalances. How does the brain react to the intrusion of psychiatric drugs such as Prozac, Ritalin, or Xanax? He asks in his book. The brain reacts as if it is being invaded by toxic substances. It tries to overcome or compensate for the harmful drug effects. In the process, the brain literally destroys its own capacity to respond to the drug. It numbs itself to the drug and, in so doing, actually kills some of its own functions. So when a doctor tells us that Prozac is putting our biochemicals into balance, we are being badly misled. In actuality, Prozac is profoundly disrupting the function of the brain. He goes on to say, these self-destructive processes in the brain are relatively easy to research. They were demonstrated in the private laboratories of Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Prozac, even before the drug was approved for marketing by the Food and Drug Administration. Long before the marketing of Prozac, the drug was known to routinely cause drastic biochemical imbalances rather than to correct them. But that's not what they told everyone. Considering how non-local and ethereal matters of the mind actually are for all of us, it baffles me, and it always did, that biological theories for mental illness outweighed all others. To a psychiatrist only interested in drug therapy under a disease-centered model, we are seen as rats before the plan for treating the underlying roots of our emotional distress is even spoken about. The unsubstantiated chemical imbalance theory is also debilitating within the healing process and does nothing to lead to a positive movement in self-growth. It implies that even after healing has begun, a person has no control over any intense emotional or mental states. The hope that things can change for the better is nullified, and trust that change is within their control is elusive. I was told for decades that I had a chemical imbalance and that this bipolar disease of mind and its symptoms were outside of my direct control, an explanation that offered me little hope to rise above such limitations. This notion can sensibly offer patients short-term relief, but excusing us from all responsibility also takes away the empowering human belief that we own our lives and can direct them through our personal actions and thoughts. And most of all, it takes away any belief in ourselves to manifest our own dreams, which to me is the deepest tragedy. Patients who are convinced their brains are somehow chemically diseased not only believe they have no power to change within themselves, but also lack the belief they can have the ability to positively influence or change the state of the world in which they live. Tying everything into biology promotes the mental illness stigma. The idea that we are somehow different than others through faulty biology is demeaning, dismissive, and lacks compassion. When a person suffers emotionally and reacts to pain in their lives, sometimes negatively, I see a normal individual who is dealing with problems with human living just like anyone else, regardless of her biology. But they begin here. From an article written on September 3rd, 2013, for the New Yorker magazine titled The Psychiatric Drug Crisis by Gary Greenberg, who's a practicing psychotherapist and the author of the Book of Woe, The DSM and the Unmaking of Psychiatry, he writes, while SSRIs surely alter serotonin metabolism, those changes do not explain why the drugs work, nor do they explain why they have proven to be no more effective than placebos in clinical trials. Within a decade of Prozac's approval by the FDA in 1987, scientists had concluded that serotonin was only a finger pointing at one's mood. that the causes of depression and the effects of the drugs were far more complex than the chemical imbalance theory implied. But although they still don't know how psychiatric drugs work, doctors continue to offer the chemical imbalance explanation inside their offices to their patients. Why? Because the narrative reassures patients and encourages them to take their medicine, and it fits in perfectly with our expectation that doctors will relieve us from our physical suffering. Thus, the psychiatrists are real doctors. Said Dr. James Davies on his Twitter account, at JDaviesPhD, the chemical imbalance myth misled an entire generation as to the origins of their emotional pain. It distracted them from its psychosocial drivers and wooed so many onto meds as the primary and most viable solution. But no one now wants to take responsibility for this. Who should? Well, not surprisingly, psychiatrists are not willing to take the heat. As Ronald W. Pies, MD, wrote with disdain towards the opposition on Medscape on April 15, 2014, in his article, Nuances, Narratives, and the Chemical Imbalance Debate in Psychiatry, in the narrative of the anti-psychiatry movement, a monolithic entity called Psychiatry has deliberately misled the public as to the causes of mental illness by failing to debunk the chemical imbalance hypothesis. Indeed, this narrative insists that by promoting this little white lie, psychiatry betrayed the public trust and made it seem as if psychiatrists had magic bullets for psychiatric disorders. In short, the chemical imbalance theory was never a real theory, nor was it widely propounded by responsible practitioners in the field of psychiatry. Then, in 2019, in another article titled Debunking the Two Chemical Myths Again, written on August 2nd, 2019, he states, scientifically speaking, there never was a network of validated hypothesis capable of sustaining a full-blown chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. Moreover, and here we come back to myth 2, psychiatry as a profession and medical specialty has never endorsed such a bogus theory. When judged by its professional organizations, its peer-reviewed publications, its standard textbooks, or its official announcements. He goes on to state that the pharmaceutical companies heavily promoted the chemical imbalance trope in their direct-to-consumer advertising. Well, that's true, but many of us heard the theories in our doctors' offices, who, I suppose, never did the research on their own and just relied on TV ads. Sorry, but I have no sympathy for these professionals who are now being pulled into the public view and questioned for not doing their own research. They are complicit. They care more about their careers than their patients. So for professional reasons, they are trying to now save face. There are no longer any absence of whistleblowers. These professionals are just in a consistent state of denial. This is a chance for psychiatrists to admit openly the truth. But because their house of cards is so feebly stacked, all their other convictions and biological theories, such as genetic factors, will be muted as well. Do you know how many billions of dollars are going into those programs? People will lose faith in this biological approach if they suddenly made a campaign to tell the truth. And they can't risk that happening. Keeping people believing means keeping their jobs, making money, and protecting their fun research goals. Let's just face it, they are basically drug pushers. Now, not all psychiatrists only have self-interests, and many out there are speaking the truth and fighting for change, such as Dr. Awais Aftab, who wrote up to a 9-part Twitter thread at Awais Aftab explaining how the folklore was perpetuated. He's a psychiatrist with philosophical interests who leads conversations in critical psychiatry for Psychiatric Times. In an article by Phil Hickey on the Mad in America website entitled Dr. Pies and the Chemical Imbalance Deception, he points out that in June of 2020, Dr. Awais Aftab published an interview he had conducted with Dr. Pies about the chemical imbalance theory. Dr. Aftab asks, Surely, as a profession, we could have done a better job of educating our patients and the public? And Dr. Pies replied, "We often hear anecdotes concerning patients who tell their current clinician some version of, 'My psychiatrist said I have a chemical imbalance.' But where is the evidence that this is what patients were actually told? Who has contacted the patient's psychiatrist or reviewed his or her case notes to see if that was really what the patient was told? To my knowledge, there has never been a study examining the other side of the story, and to be clear, patients are not infallible recorders of what their doctors tell them." Touchy, are we? So the lack of integrity and spreading of lies is the patient's fault. And of course, since we are mentally ill, we cannot be trusted to tell the truth. Not surprising, the burden of proof also relies on us. Our dependence upon scientific conclusions on delivering the ultimate truth to us has shaped our worldview and has become a form of religion. And this tendency for anyone in the so-called science of psychiatry to take high offense to a patient who isn't convinced of their miracle cures maybe is too sensitive and should be taking meds themselves. Sounds abrasive? Imagine the world that so many psych patients have experienced who were told their brain is diseased. It's cringeworthy. On Twitter, clinical psychologist Lucy Johnstone puts it so well. At ClinPsychLucy. She states, "Chemical imbalances. We never said it. We said it once, 30 years ago. Patients made us say it. Patients imagined we said it. Patients with philosophy degrees know we didn't mean it even though we said it. It's partly true anyway. One day it'll be proven. Other doctors tell even more lies than us." And Dr. James Davies answers his own question on who should take responsibility. My answer? Psychiatry bears ultimate responsibility for the chemical imbalance myth. Aside from promoting it, it stood by as the myth grew, spread, and wooed millions into taking drugs that for so many caused harm. Psychiatry has offered no redress or apology for its complicity. The end. Let's be real. We were told such things. We would never have come up with such a story on our own. This erroneous information is everywhere. From an article written by Ashley Bobak on the Mad in America website on April 22, 2020, titled Antidepressant Misinformation Promoted on Popular Websites, a study by researchers Marianne DeMasi and Peter Goethe, titled Presentation of Benefits and Harms of Antidepressants on Websites, a Cross-Sectional Study, in the International Journal of Risk and Safety in Medicine, found that a majority of the popular websites they reviewed did not accurately present the scientific evidence on the risks and benefits of antidepressants and promoted the disproven chemical imbalance theory. The authors write, "We found that the information about the benefits and harms of antidepressants on 39 popular websites contained information that conflicted with the scientific evidence." They examined 39 websites from 10 countries. Websites such as Family Doctor in New Zealand. Clinical depression is believed to be caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. Or Johns Hopkins Medicine. It's a chemical imbalance in your brain that needs to be treated. Or Sane Australia. Medications help the brain to restore its usual chemical balance. Or Health 24 in South Africa. Brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, play a mediating role in the development of depression. Or in 1177 Van Guyden in Sweden. Antidepressant drugs affect and increase the activity of the neurotransmitters to restore balance. Or in British Columbia Health Link BC in Canada, chemicals in your brain called neurotransmitters may be out of balance. This campaign that has been going on for decades encourages individuals to continue taking antidepressants, believing that depression is something that needs to be managed for the rest of their lives, just like diabetes must be managed through insulin. A regimen of lifelong treatment was a claim made by some of the websites reviewed in the current study, which is concerning, especially since there's no current research studies that provide evidence that lifetime antidepressant use is necessary. As Sarah Hancock on Twitter at Psych Recovery stated on July 26, 2021, if psychiatry didn't believe a version of the chemical imbalance myth, they'd stop prescribing medications that induce imbalances, where there are none. Long-term consequences are brutal because bodies constantly adapting, striving to regain homeostasis. There are many others in the field who tell it like it is as well, so it can always help us survivors in the long run to create allies. But after the abuse many of us have endured, we have a huge litmus test for knowing which psychiatrists to trust. Some, like Peter Breggin and Joanna Moncrief, have a mission to address the lies on a daily crusade. If we moved from a disease-centered model back to a drug-centered model, and use drugs for mental health problems in a drug-centered way, we need to know more information than we currently have about all the changes and alterations that drugs produce. All the mental changes and also the physical changes, says Joanna Moncrief, what they do in the short term and how those changes pan out in the long term. Because sometimes it's different if you keep taking a drug the body will adapt to. Its presence and the effects that it has immediately don't necessarily continue. And because of that, as well, when people stop taking a drug, they can often get quite profound withdrawal symptoms. So we need to know also about withdrawal effects. And when we know what we've got, a really good picture of what sort of effects a drug might have, we can then ask whether those effects might be useful in a particular individual situation. We also, of course, need to ask that even if they are useful for some, do they outweigh the adverse effects of taking an active substance? And are there alternative ways of dealing with the problem? Well, as Ann Cook states on her Twitter account at AnnCook14, who is a clinical psychologist interested in the power of ideas, particularly the idea of mental illness. She cites a Harvard study proving the chemical imbalance narrative has worse outcomes in mental health. In the study, participants who are told that their depression is caused by chemical imbalance or genetic abnormality expect to have depression for a longer period, report more depressive symptoms, and feel they have less control over their negative emotions. Because, and I know what this feels like, they are told by a medical authority that we essentially have no control over our own minds. And we also have no self-autonomy over our lives, as they convince the family and loved ones we need to be watched and cared for like a kid forever. And yet, to be fair and balanced, some people swear by these meds and claim that they were life-changing. And I am not one to pill shame. As someone who understands the drug-centered approach, I smoke weed, and I'm fine with that. Knowing it's psychoactive and its relaxing properties help my anxiety and balance my day. I truly feel much more mentally balanced incorporating this into my life. But there is no physical dependency with marijuana. And as more research is being done, we are finding the safety profile for this plant is incredible. This is absolutely not the case with psychiatric medication. So, moral of the story? Get Big Pharma the hell out of your lives. Life is better with wine and weed. Consumers are no longer safe in the hands of all-knowing doctors. We must make informed choices about prescription drug use and not blindly trust doctors. We have the internet today, and we can do our own research and rely on communities on Twitter and other social media platforms to help rewrite the story. Thanks for listening to Not As Crazy As You Think, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And remember, mental health is attainable for anyone, especially those labeled with mental illness. Until next time, peace out.